using such scientific criteria as dietary and sartorial customs.
Wait a minute. No way. He didn't. No, he did. He used a satire image from an issue of Harper's Magazine dedicated to mocking the Irish. In that same magazine, the creators used these super serious images to portray the Irish. Oh boy, when they fall for the Harper's lineup, which I've seen before, you just know that this video is going to be something very special indeed.
Yea, verily.
So ContraPoints made a race denial video a while back, and a bunch of people have wanted me to respond. He made it a long time ago, but I'm back on YouTube, so I figured why not. Scripture Points actually spends most of the video either poisoning the well or playing dress-up, not much time dealing with the actual topic. And we'll deal with his well poisoning, but first let's deal with his scientific race denial, which is all very pedestrian. So his arguments: first, he has more variation within than between. Always a classic. Second, the continuum fallacy. Solid choice for a race denial lineup. And his third argument is race categories don't map to genetic clusters. He has a particularly stupid variant of this using haplogroups. Who here remembers concordance? If you do, well then, you're in for a treat. So, more variation within than between. Vintage Lewontin.
It's pretty well known that around 85% of genetic variation is found within groups, meaning that any two individuals from different populations are not likely to be much more different than any two individuals from the same population. And only around 6 to 10% of total variation is found between continental groups.
The quickest way to show that this is a stupid and not an argument is to point to chimpanzees. Depending on which loci you use for the analysis, there's more variation within humans and chimpanzees than between them. You can also model gender differences as an FST distance, treating the Y chromosome and deactivated analogs on the X chromosome as an allele frequency difference of 100%, which just means 100% variation at those gene locations. And oh look, more variation within than between. And in fact, the gender differences, despite being typological differences, because they're only at a few loci, they're actually swamped by the race differences. Moreover, more variation within than between is true for basically every species that has an identifiable subspecies. I've compiled the list of mammals that have FST distances around that of humans, which means they all have more variation within than between. I guess brown bears and polar bears don't have typological differences because there's more variation within than between. So, are we done? To ContraPoints and to any, race denier listener here, are we done with this stupid argument? Keep in mind that the more variation within than between argument, this is a pub shock argument. It's not an argument that influenced any actual population geneticist, okay? But that last line he makes is particularly annoying.
Meaning that any two individuals from different populations are not likely to be much more different than any two individuals from the same population.
This is one of those little shitballs that takes longer to respond to than it does to make. And a simplified way to explain why this is wrong is to use binomial probability. Nevin Sasardik does a much more in-depth explanation than this, but think of each gene as a loaded coin flip. And say with each coin flip you have a 60% chance of being more similar to someone of your own genetic cluster, however defined, than to someone of another cluster. If humans only had one gene, i.e. one coin flip, well, you would be more similar to someone of another cluster only around 40% of the time, and would only have a greater similarity to someone within your cluster 60% of the time. If you have 20 genes, this goes up to around 75%. If you have 100 genes, this goes up to something like 96 or 97%. And by the time you get to 500 genes or 500 coin flips, you're at virtually 100% chance of being more similar to someone in your own cluster than to someone in another cluster. Of course, in reality, it's not quite like this. It's not that you have a 10% chance of greater similarity evenly distributed across the whole genome to another person in your cluster. That's just the average. In reality, it's more like you have a 90% chance of greater similarity at a few locations, and everywhere else it's like 50%, 50%, 51%, 50%, 98%, 50%, 50%. It's like that. ContraPoints then shows a haplogroup map.
including across continental divides. So there are no distinct boundaries separating continental populations from each other, and the continental populations themselves are not homogeneous. This is evident when you look at, for instance, the distribution of Y chromosome haplogroups across the globe. Categories like white, black, and Asian are therefore extremely arbitrary ways of dividing up the genetic continuum.
Now, first off, this is stupid because if we compare, say, Europeans and Native Americans, we can see with his own chart visually a typological distinction between these two ends in terms of haplogroup. And so ContraPoints' argument for race denial here is based entirely on the continuum fallacy, right? On these mixed intermediate populations. So, do we have to explain the continuum fallacy, that a muddled middle doesn't preclude categorical distinctions between any particular population comparison? Is this really the level we're at? Middle schoolers don't come up with arguments this stupid. But more basic than that, haplogroups are just ancestral lines. They're not whole genomic genetic clusters. They're not best fit genetic clusters when you set K to 10 or something. The purpose of haplogroup analysis is just to trace back evolutionary lineage, not necessarily genetic similarity. Of course, there's going to be some relation in that people of the same haplogroup will tend to be more genetically similar to each other than they are to people of different haplogroups, but haplogroups are not genetic similarity clusters. They're not best fit genetic clusters using some sort of algorithm, okay? And so this is not the appropriate thing to use when we're talking about races. Not surprisingly, since he took everything else from concordance, ContraPoints then parrots concordance's stupid argument that the classical races don't map onto haplogroups.
The upshot is that while geneticists and physical anthropologists can divide humans into populations based on ancestry, there is no scientific reason for those divisions to track traditional race categories.
Well, no shit, Sherlock, why would they? Races were based on physiological and psychological characteristics, not maternal or paternal lineage. But races do map onto best fit genetic clusters, and this is a well-replicated finding. There are several studies where they take a person's self-identified race, then look at their DNA, and tell a computer to blindly classify the DNA into a certain number of clusters based on the people that are giving their DNA. And when the number of clusters used is the same as the number of classical races identified, you get basically a 100% correspondence, or very close to it, between the classical races and best fit cluster. Now, one thing ContraPoints and concordance like to say is that the number of clusters is arbitrary, that there's no genetic reason to have 7 or 5 or 300.
In fact, there is no purely genetic justification for using, say, 5 race categories as opposed to just 1 or 300 or 3 million.
Well, whoop-de-doo! Okay, so the number of colors is arbitrary. Purple doesn't exist. And he only uses this argument when talking about humans. He doesn't have a big bug up his butt when he's talking about the number of divisions that we divide foxes or bears or wolves into, right? This is a human-specific criticism, right? And this is all apparently part of a lame thought experiment he had about aliens, right? Imagining that aliens would classify humans along haplogroup lines because he doesn't know what a haplogroup is. So that's the actual arguments, to the extent you can even call them that, done with. Concordance isn't saying anything new, he's just repeating stock nonsense from the 1970s. More variation within than between continuum fallacy and real genetic categories don't map to the races. The only twist he had was in the third argument, and it was stupid in that he used haplogroups instead of best fit clusters. Other than that, it was all just the classics. One tell of extreme ideology and ContraPoints is the use of the term pure.
And because of global gene flow, there are no pure races, no matter how many categories you choose, with the possible exception of some Pacific Islanders. This is especially true in countries with recent global immigration, like the US and Brazil, where mixed European, African, and Amerindian ancestry is the norm. These points are all made more eloquently and in much more detail in a 2-part video by Concordance, which I highly recommend and have linked to in the description.
He lashes out at people who recognize evolution in humans with the implication that we're obsessed with some kind of weird purity.
I just want to be pure.
Okay, he then says, there has been gene flow. But of course, really important question, how much has there been and what impact has this had on the similarity of psychological traits and what this means for the functionality of a multiracial state in the real world? But to him, none of this matters. These aren't real questions, because in his little world, apparently I
Just wanna be pure.
ContraPoints then makes up a story about how the old-timey racial thinkers lumped Melanesians in with Africans, when in reality they were categorized as distinct from Africans at first contact in 1788, based on their differences from black African populations in appearance and behavior. ContraPoints, he just doesn't know anything. He then has a whole little section about how dog breeds aren't analogous to human races because they were intensively bred. Like, why is he so hard up on this when there are so many other species with recognized subspecies that humans are analogous to, both in terms of total heterozygosity and clusteredness? It's because he doesn't know. He spends a whole pointless section talking about domestic dog breeds, ignorant that there's like at least 100 other mammals analogous to humans in terms of amount of clusteredness of genetic diversity. It's a completely made-up exclusion criteria anyway. Humans have had as much selection in the past 5,000 years as they had in the past 500,000 years. And so the highly compressed recent human evolution is closer to the experience of domestic dog breeds than it is to other wild animals. So the analogy between human races and domestic dog breeds is far more appropriate than most people realize. Both are the result of intensive human-directed breeding. But again, like, who cares? Right? We have all these other wild mammals with similar heterozygosity and clusteredness levels, which all have recognized subspecies, so we don't even need domestic dog breeds to point out the hypocrisy and double standards used to deny races in humans. But what race denial video would be complete without some historically illiterate well poisoning? He spends a bunch of time talking about
The Nazis.
but, to my amazement, didn't once consider how this kind of argument could boomerang back onto him. Now, you'd think genocide would be a no-go zone for any kind of blank slate social constructivist thinker, but it's, I guess not. It's so kitsch for me to have to do this, but okay, let's compare the kill counts of the communist, new socialist man regimes to Hitler. Look, they're bigger, they're more recent, and unlike Nazism, the kind of bizarro blank slate Marxoid thinking that led to these atrocities are actually more in line with what's popular in universities than the dreaded race realists, right? Whereas Aryanism or Hyperboreanism, that the stuff that informed Hitler's thinking, simply doesn't exist at all in the universities, and in fact, it doesn't even exist among the race realists. In addition, the countries that ultimately defeated Hitler all had white nationalist policies, and their popular thinking on race back then was what we today would call race realism. Back then it wasn't called race realism, it was just called biology and anthropology. A majority in the US at the time supported racial segregation, and white-only immigration policies were so totally supported that it wasn't even a topic of debate or any kind of polling. Which is to say that the kind of racial thinking that most closely approximates mine was actually the chief culprit in defeating Nazi Germany. The closest analog to how ContraPoints thinks on race at that time would be the Soviet Union. So basically, race realists defeated Hitler and are now being blamed for Hitler, while the blank slate crap that justified communist mass killings never gets linked to those whose views are much closer to them than mine are to Hitler. Scripture Points also brings up discrimination, but the only discrimination he points to is whites wanting to have their own spaces free from blacks. Meanwhile, Scripture Points supports institutional discrimination against whites, not just segregation where you have, the black schools and the white schools, the black businesses, the white businesses, the black towns and the white towns, or a mixed area for people who want it, right? No. He wants all the schools discriminating against whites. This is called affirmative action, and it's justified with equalist thinking. Yes, right, because race doesn't exist. All inequalities between the races must be a result of non-genetic factors, circumstance, environment. Therefore, discrimination against whites is justified until outcomes are equalized. So, while Scripture Points kvetches about discrimination, the real institutional discrimination that actually exists is against whites, and it's justified with ContraPoints' kind of flat earth approach to human biology. And unlike segregation of the past, it is totalitarian in nature. ContraPoints makes it clear that we cannot totally divorce discussions of race from the real political context, and I agree. Flat Earth theories of human biology have proven to be much more dangerous than evolution-based theories of human biology, and are a clear and present danger today, and are used to justify discrimination against whites today, which is why we shouldn't be so eager to rush headlong into Marxoid biology-denying arguments that tend to get people killed. He then makes a bunch of just really irresponsible claims. For example, the claim that colonialism and slavery were justified by racism. Of course, this is just retconning. Europe was doing what literally all states prior had done, which was to expand and conquer as much as they can get away with. The only thing unique about the European empires was how they took over most of the world and then decided to give up their empires without them being taken away from them militarily or from collapsing internally. Conquering and enslaving was the norm for all of human existence. What was unique about Europe was not that they did it, but that Europe eventually ended it. And they ended it around the time that scientific racial thinking started to become popular, with Darwin's book, quote, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Saying that Europeans justified slavery with scientific racism is just retconning. One way we kind of know that scientific racism was not the justification for slavery in the US is that in the US it ended in 1865, while the scientific study of race did not go into decline until after World War II, for obvious reasons, and scientific racism is largely considered to have peaked in the 1920s. Basically, the idea that scientific theories of race were the primary justifier for colonialism and slavery doesn't fit the timeline, given that such ideas didn't begin to be noticeably informing the public debate until towards the end of the empires and after slavery. ContraPoints then brings up some stupid quotes from some guys in the 1700s talking about race. Well, good for them. I can find some stupid things that some biology deniers thought. I can't find specific quotes because I'd have to go through and read a whole bunch of stuff again, but I can tell you the ideas right here. Franz Boas treated culture as a thing sui generis that acted independently of biology, that culture was a superorganism that acted through, though independent of, human biology. Or we can talk about Margaret Mead, who wrote in Coming of Age in Samoa that monogamy was purely a Western social construct and that virginity was not valued. Turns out Margaret Mead, instead of investigating the Samoans, just asked them. And the Samoans, of course, told her a bunch of lies, and she published them. Franz Boas, not surprisingly, gave a ringing endorsement of her book. And let's not forget Lysenkoism, the belief that evolution doesn't come from natural selection, but from adaptation to the environment. Natural selection was castigated as bourgeois science. According to Lysenko, the first generation would adapt, for example, to the cold a little bit. And when they had kids, that kid would already be adapted, and then would be able to adapt a little more. And so it was through each generation's adaptations to the environment layered on top of each other that evolution occurred. This led to the firings and less often executions of over 3,000 bourgeois biologists and geneticists, and Lysenkoism was the official doctrine of the Soviet Union from 1927 to 1964, and is credited with having stunted the development of Soviet biology, psychology, and of course, genetics. Or we can go way back and go back to Greek and Roman times when they believed that sun exposure caused long-term skin darkening and changes to appearance and behavior, and that it was the sun exposure that caused black Africans to have the black skin and to be violent and lazy, and that it was the lack of sun exposure to the Germanic peoples to the north that caused them to have light skin and to be violent. Wow, environmental explanations for variations in human biology in the past sure were stupid. Isn't this fun? Right? Finding all these stupid little anecdotes. Look at all these stupid things that environmental determinists in the past believed. Wow, they were really, really stupid. I now proclaim this to be the intellectual firmament in which ContraPoints comes from, and that all you are, ContraPoints, is a modern rationalization of those past stupid ideas.
Concepts.
This is all good and well, but when are we going to measure the skulls?
If I may quote a friend of mine, what is it with you people and skulls?
Is it so wrong to enjoy the touch of cold bones?
Guys, something that's going to happen here, this is actually like really funny. because he has like a fetish for bone and skulls, and it's like, and he's gonna put his finger into the skull, and it's gonna be like having sex with the skull. And this is like really funny and worth like thousands of likes and like a bunch of money being given to him for this.